Welcome to the second series of our fall seminars. Today we have Dr. Marcus Coleman, who is recently graduated from LSU with doctorate degree in agriculture and extension education. Now he is a visiting assistant professor in School of Arts at Tulane University. And today he will talk about connecting agriculture and the food system.
Good afternoon, everybody. Happy to be here today. Just to give, is it good? So just to kind of give everybody a little bit background information about who I am and kind of why I'm here. Most recently, I spent the past 3 years at LSU where I was working for the LSU Ag Center. There, I directed a farmer training program where we focused on supporting new and beginning farmers across the state. And so part of the talk today will focus on some of that work and some of the things that we found in working with new and beginning farmers here in Louisiana, but also looking at opportunities and threats. And so some of you here today, might have interest in local food systems or local farming and things like that. So we'll talk about some of the things that we found there. But also the second part of what I'll discuss here today is related to food access. I'm a Louisiana native. I'm originally from the northeast corner of Louisiana, Tensas Parish area. So understanding and working with and doing work related to food access and the things that kind of comprise and make up what food access is from an economic perspective is something that I'm really interested in. And so we'll talk about some of that work as well. But right now, I'm in my first semester. I left LSU in my first semester at Tulane University in the School of Liberal Arts, helping to start a new academic program in strategy, leadership, and analytics. I also have a joint appointment in the economics department at Tulane. So I'm very excited about that piece. And why being housed in the School of Liberal Arts is kind of like a perfect fit for me through much of the work that I've done in food access, but also new and beginning farmer training and development. Many of the folks that I've worked with throughout the years didn't come into our program or didn't come to us for support with those traditional agriculture backgrounds, folks that didn't grow up on farm. Many of the folks had liberal arts interests. And so I have a very liberal arts heavy approach in our training approaches and our teaching approaches, just because based upon the work that I've done, I've just had this very interdisciplinary type audience. And so being able to do this work and help to start a new academic program at Tulane has been pretty fun. Although we've had the past 2 weeks off due to Hurricane Ida. So that kind of put a stop on the semester. But hey, it's Louisiana, we do what we can, right? All right, let's get started here. So when I talk about a food system, how I look at a food system and how I define a food system, I like to put this definition up because what I've also found is that many people have wide-ranging definitions of when we say local food systems, when we say food systems, or when we say agriculture, about what those things mean to us. And so when I'm talking about a food system or food system development and those processes, I'm looking at this from the standpoint of how we grow, transport, sell, or even exchange of food through community food banks and things like that. But those processes and how those processes impact a very diverse group of individuals, businesses, and communities. And so primarily you can look at that from various different aspects, right? I tend to look at it from more of a social and economic lens. You can also look at that from a political lens. You can also look at these aspects from more of an environmental lens, of how externalities from these processes impact the environment. One of the courses that I teach at Tulane is environmental economics. And so we look at these things from the perspective of, say, cost-benefit analysis and how we look at those. And so this kind of sets the stage for what I mean by that. Also, when I talk about food access and the term food access, I look at it from the perspective of how well does the agri-food system meet the needs of consumers, okay? By virtue of that, we talked about the process of growing food, how we transform food through the agricultural marketing channels, how we transport food to where consumers are, but also the process of selling food. And that takes on many different angles. You can even, the direct marketing aspect of it, for example, like the work that here in Lafayette, that the Acadiana Food Alliance does, and there's a series of farmers markets that take place here in the city. I'm even looking at the direct marketing aspect of how consumers, get their food. And much of this process not only has the food system flow, but it also looks at how consumer demand impacts it. So I'm very interested in much of the work that I've done looks at the two extremes of kind of the food system flow, looking at from a production perspective, but also looking at the impacts of how everything that happens along that chain impacts consumers. But in talking about consumers and looking at these things from a consumer perspective, what drives consumer behavior, right? And so generally speaking, theoretically speaking, consumer behavior is driven by disposable income, right? So at a very base level, when we're talking about food, we're talking about food access, food acquisition. Consumers, all of us in this room, we seek food, one, because it's nutritious, because it's safe, and because it's affordable. And in theory, as our disposable incomes increase, the reasons to which we buy our food or buy specific types of foods transforms, right? So we make a little more money, all of a sudden now we switch from buying food because it's affordable to saying, well, let me buy this particular food product because it tastes good. All the way up to the top of that chain, we begin to support various statuses and causes. And so, you know, we go from buying a chicken in a grocery store because we can afford it to buying chicken at a farmer's market that's free range, cage free, things like that. And so when I'm talking about consumer behavior, I tend to use this simple kind of pyramid diagram to kind of frame the changing, how consumers change as their disposable incomes increase. And then the last piece of this to kind of set the stage for the overall work is this framework for food access that I've been working on in a number of different areas. And so when I talk about food access, the intersection of food access and the food system, or how we as consumers or how individuals or how communities get their food, we look at this from various constructs. At the center of much of this is this notion of affordability. And the construct of affordability can be derived in many different ways. Is food priced at a certain range that's affordable to a consumer, right? Or does a consumer's budget allow them to purchase specific types of food? And then there's some other boxes that go around that. So accessibility, and particularly for me, accessibility and availability, because I'm very interested in food access as it relates to rural communities. Do consumers in specific types of communities actually have access to retail food locations where they can purchase things such as affordable, healthful foods, right? Or if they have access to retail locations, are healthful foods actually available at those retail locations, right? So if you look at the hometown in Tensaw Parish where I grew up, we currently right now have $1 store and one gas station in the town. They're building another dollar store, so we'll have $2 stores and gas stations in the town. We have retail locations that are available. It's an agricultural driven community, but when you go into those things, healthful foods are just not available in those communities. And so I'm really, and also looking at the notion of acceptability. So when we're going in and we're providing access, are the types of foods that we're providing consumers access to, are they the types of food that people actually desire, right? It's kind of the notion. I was giving a talk at a conference in Atlanta. It's kind of the notion of going into certain communities and telling communities, you should grow kale, you should eat more kale, when that community has grown up eating mustard greens and collard greens all their life, right? So it's this notion of acceptability and then accommodation. You know, how do we put, you know, systemic mechanisms in place to ensure that, one, if consumers don't have access or things are available, how can we get them to the places that do certain things like that? And so that just kind of sets the stage for the two extremes of what I'll talk about here today. The first part is, this is kind of been the joy for me over the past 3 or so years, and I'm still working on several projects related to this at LSU. But how do we empower Louisiana's next generation of new and beginning farmers? And the couple that we see here are Madeline and Timothy. They run a small farm, Compostela Farm over in Picayune, Mississippi. There are a number of small scale operations here in the Lafayette area that we could talk, successful, but this is just a great example of folks who didn't have this traditional agricultural or come from a farming background that started a successful farm. Just a little background about this couple. They started their farm, Madeline is from the New Orleans area. Timothy is kind of an international phenomenon. He started off in England and went to Germany and ended up here in the States, right? They wanted to buy land in the Hammond area, couldn't find affordable land in Louisiana, so they bought land in Picayune, Mississippi, 5-acre property. Prior to COVID-19, much of it, and they focus on salad greens. Much of their operation, they sold specifically to a set of about 25 or 30 restaurants in New Orleans. And so essentially, their growing business model was to the point pre-COVID, where they almost had a monopoly on fresh salad greens across many of the upscale restaurants in New Orleans. COVID hit, they partnered with, we have a dynamic young beginning farmer network in the southeast region of the state, where they switched to more of selling CSA type stuff and assisting other farmers in farmers markets. So they still had some income due to that. But they're a very good example of why we do the kind of work that we do, but also why it's important. But they also provide a very good example that even if any of you are interested in local food systems for farming, that you don't necessarily always have to go into this with a lot of money. Those opportunities are there, but you have to understand and know what the opportunities are and understand what the threats are. We'll talk about some of that here shortly. So just kind of, giving a brief background. If we look at Louisiana's farm scene, and like I said, I'm from an agricultural community. This picture of a cotton picker harvesting was from last harvesting season in Franklin Parish. So I was on this farm. So we look at what the Census of Agriculture said in 2017. We had about 27,000 farms in Louisiana, right? The majority of the farm operators that, and I'll put this disclaimer on here, the farm operators that responded to the Census of Agriculture, because there's some issue with the data there, were 91% white, 35% of them were women. And the most interesting piece that I found with this was that of all the farmers in the state of Louisiana, only 4 reported that they sold directly to consumers. They sell at farmers market CSA, which we all know that's not true, because if you go to a farmer's market or the farmer's market here in Lafayette, you know that there's more than 4 people selling produce directly to consumers there. So that's one of the issues with that Census of Agriculture data, that we're working with the USDA National Ag Statistics Service in order to make sure that more producers are responding to this information, so we have better information and better data available to assist folks. The other key aspect about agricultural production in Louisiana, it's highly concentrated on commodity crops. And so, of course, here in this region, sugarcane and rice, where I'm from, cotton, corn, and soybeans, Northwest, Central, kind of forestry products, things like that. So, input this program in 2018, right? The Grow Louisiana Beginning Farmer Training Program. And so, we focus on the southeast region of Louisiana, new and beginning farmers. Emphasis was placed on socially disadvantaged, urban, and underrepresented groups and veterans. Because based upon national numbers, we just know we have to diversify our farmer base in many different areas. But also the focus was on specialty and horticultural crops. So those crops that we can go in and help build family farm businesses where they can, one, either sell directly to consumer or even sell in the retail or wholesale sectors. But we wanted to make sure the focus here was on individuals that had an interest in selling food. So emphasis on food there. The project was funded by the USDA National Institute of Food and Agriculture. They have a beginning farmer and rancher development program, which has been like clutch for what we do here in this state. Because even though we have an extension service here in the state that's supposed to support these things, much of that work is based upon large-scale commodity producers. And very minimal effort in that work is placed on new and beginning farmers, particularly those that are interested in horticultural production. The goals of the program were very simple. We wanted to be the first statewide extension-based agriculture education program. When I say extension-based, that's simply meaning that we're using academic expertise, so we have researchers and also extension agents that specialize in different areas that provide us programmatic support, but also provide direct support to our program participants, or just new and beginning farmers in general that are interested in agriculture. And we hope that this is a long-term project. And so we hope that it is something that's been successful enough in the state of this funding in, that the work that we've done and the programs that we've put in place, we just hope that they simply don't go away. So that's kind of a background of the program. One of the interesting things about the program is we have several partnerships with that program. Of course, the LSU Ag Center is the lead on that program. But here locally, we had a year-long project here in Lafayette to which the Acadiana Food Alliance was a partner with us on that project. We also have some partners down in New Orleans, Market Umbrella and Sprout Nola, who I must add right now, just doing amazing work on the ground. Because much of the city of New Orleans has been without power since last week, Monday. And so those folks at Market Umbrella and Sprout Nola facilitate farmers markets, specifically in the city. And so they've been doing a great job of just making sure that there's food on the ground in many different areas, but also making sure that the producers that we have in the New Orleans area that were impacted by the hurricane, that they have some support as well. And so what we do is we utilize those resources, and we bring in actual farmers to help instruct. And so for myself, you know, as the program lead on that, I'm not a farmer. I don't claim to be a farmer. I don't even want to be a farmer, right? And so what can I tell a farmer about a farming operation? And so we do a great job of working with younger and experienced farmers to bring them in to share their knowledge with folks who are interested in the sector. That's worked out really well. Number one for us, because it helps us to fill a void. But also number two, you know, we have to create a mechanism in the state where we have a training ground for individuals like yourselves who may be interested in local food systems and agriculture, but want to have somewhere to go where you can be an apprentice or an intern and get that hands-on experience. And so it's very important to us in this regard to help train the farmers that we do have that are interested in this work in the state, to train them how to teach other folks to do what they're doing. So that's been clutch for us, and we've been very excited about that. Another big part of that program was our farmer networking and information sharing. So this Louisiana Collaborative Regional Alliance for Farmer Training is a farmer-led coalition where they all come together. We host field days pre-COVID. We host field days on farm where farmers talk about, say, a specific technique or something very specific that they do and do it well. And they train other farmers in the area to do those things. But it also provides an opportunity for them to do some networking and some mentoring. We've even been able to do some internships and some apprenticeships from that. So that's been a very good piece of that. And the most important piece is experience-based learning. So our goal there was to get folks out of the classroom, get folks on the ground to really get hands-on experience to become better farmers. Why is this work important to us, at least from what we found and from what the data suggests nationally, not just here in Louisiana? One, we have an Asian farmer network just across the board. There's also this push to build these more community-based food systems. And so when you have issues where in communities, inner city communities, rural communities, where food access is maybe an issue for some, and we can kind of centralize the production and provide additional opportunities for agricultural production and food system development within communities, that can help communities be better off related to food access. But it also provides opportunities for economic development in communities. You know, many times in communities, when we're looking at our economic development corporations, much of that work tends to be focused on big businesses. And shout out to the work that happens in central Louisiana, Cleta, up in Alexandria. They've made it a point to include local food systems and food system development as a part of their economic development mission. The other big part of this is making sure, one, that we diversify agriculture and the food system, not just from a racial or gender perspective, but we want to diversify the type of crops that are grown in Louisiana. As Louisiana's population diversifies, more people are moving to the state, more people are moving to the state to work at the institutions in the state. That leads to a more diverse palette of individuals that are here. And so they're looking for crops that they're used to that may not have historically been grown here in the state. And particularly in New Orleans, we have a lot of success with this kind of stuff. And so now we also want to bring back that notion of the family farm as well. But for me, you know, the most important thing about this is the notion of community economic development, making sure, one, that individuals know that there's a place for you in food and agriculture. We can train you, but you can also make a living off food and agriculture. A key piece here that, you know, it can't be misstated enough that, you know, engaging in agriculture and farming, you know, there's physical, mental, and nutritional health aspects of it that go in there as well that we can't understate enough. What are the opportunities for new and beginning farmers that we found throughout the work that we've done? At the end of the day, it's always told students in the classroom, at the end of the day, you can find work in food and agriculture because people got to eat. We all eat different things, but at the end of the day, we got to eat, right? We may purchase things at different price points at different places, but the unifying factor to that is people's got to eat. And so the other part of that, as I mentioned earlier, is that we have diverse palates. And so that widens the type of products that we can grow and offer. But also there's this need in communities like certain communities here in Lafayette, what we found in Baton Rouge, what we found in New Orleans, is that we've got to increase availability and access to healthy foods for communities that need them the most. And in many cases here in the state, we look at that from the inner city perspective. And a lot of that folks in the work that our partners that I work with has been done in New Orleans, but there's a real need in the state in our rural communities as well. And so really there's opportunities for you. So I said it to say that if you're interested in farming, starting a farm operation like that, urban agriculture is nice, and I'm not pushing people away from urban agriculture, but there's a lot of land and opportunities in the rural community that you can take advantage of, right? And so don't immediately discount rural Louisiana or rural communities in America if you start to thinking about some of these things, right? There's a growing need in the local and regional food movement. So people now want to know where their food is coming from. There's an increased interest from individuals to know who they're getting their food from. Particularly with the onset of COVID-19, we found that the increased demand for local food systems increased. When in many cases, grocery stores had supply issues, many of our local farmers saw increased sales at their farm because people had to figure out and find alternative ways to purchase their produce. And so that provided an opportunity. Many, the negative things that we hear about COVID-19 and during that pandemic, for food and for local agriculture, it was a highlight because many of our local farmers saw success. They were selling at farmers markets when COVID-19 hit and the farmers market closed. Many of them switched to online sales platforms or CSA, community supported agriculture, where it's a subscription service, where you pay a subscription fee at the beginning of the growing season, and each week for 8 to 10 to 12 to 14 weeks, that farmer provides you with a box of produce. And that's something that we're seeing that's growing more and more in this region. Also, the availability of alternative horticulture and specialty crop and livestock production systems, whereas now you don't need these grand, large operations to be involved in food and agriculture. So that's provided an opportunity for us to engage more people in these areas. There's a growth in demand for organics and other specialty production methods that we've seen. We talked about, alternative market availability that we've seen growing, but also the key piece here is the availability of non-traditional agricultural land, and that's also in both rural and urban areas. And so what we see in New Orleans is that people are taking advantage, and I don't say taking advantage of in a negative way. They're taking advantage of the opportunities for vacant lands, and they're turning these into urban farming plots. And we have a great example in New Orleans, River Queen Greens Farm. Annie and Cheryl came to New Orleans about 5 years ago from the Northeast, from the Boston area. They started off on a 1/4 of an acre lot in the Bywater area, in the 7th Ward of New Orleans. And they recently purchased an 88-acre lot on the West Bank of New Orleans. So there are opportunities that exist for anybody that wants to be engaged in these areas. But there are a number of threats that also persist that we have to be aware of. And in the work that we've done, we've found these things have been present nationally, but in the work that we've done here locally in the state, particularly in the southeastern region, we find that these things still persist here as well, right? So for folks that are interested in engaging and getting into the opportunities with food and agriculture, access to capital resources. In many cases, no matter the scale, agriculture and farming is a highly capital intensive process, right? You have to have access to land, you also have to have access to equipment. And that looks very different in different scales of production. But also having access to lines of credit and other things that are necessary to get those things. Oftentimes the high cost of infrastructure development is a piece of that. Another big piece of which we sought to fill the void in that is access to knowledge, access to information, access to sufficient support network. Because as I said, many of the folks that we were working with did not come to us with these traditional agricultural backgrounds. They come to us with more liberal arts background, more social science background, sociology, psychology type backgrounds. And so being able to provide opportunities and information to these folks where they needed it. The history of agriculture in this country, the history of the USDA, the history of the Department of Extension Services we've seen, it, particularly across the southeast region of the U.S., has led us to be able to deal with and confront these historical inequities that we've seen in agriculture and the food system, whether it's racial inequities, whether it's gender inequities. And USDA is now addressing some of these things and highlighting some of these things and providing opportunities for individuals that may not have had historic access to be in agriculture and the food system or find a place for them to work in agriculture and the food system. We're now beginning to have mechanisms in place for people to address these things. And then this notion of respect, right? And so if you're a new and beginning farmer, you're interested in urban agriculture, and you want to farm on 1/8 of an acre plot here in Lafayette, right? Can you, as this urban farmer that's farming on this 1/8 of an acre plot in Lafayette, go down the road to Rain and talk to a rice farmer that's farming on 2,000 acres? And so what we've tried to do with that is just create opportunities for dialogue between those two farmers. You know, historically, people look at folks that are traditional to the agricultural sector have looked at folks that, if you're farming on 1/8 of an acre, oh, that's just a little garden or a backyard plot, right? But we have data now to show that, people have made successful, profitable farming operations with as less as 1/8 of an acre or 1/4 of an acre. And so there are opportunities there. And so much of the work that we were doing, sought to engage different areas and different pieces and aspects of the food system. Big piece that I say here for me was the community economic development. And so this work that we've been doing has allowed us to increase the number of fruit and vegetable acreage in or around or near local communities, increase availability at farmers market, also providing opportunities for folks that have sufficient scale to sell at grocery stores and other areas, increase agricultural diversity, not only from a producer perspective, but also with the types of crops grown. But more importantly, increase opportunities for entrepreneurship, right? And so what I always tell people is like in food system development, we often talk about entrepreneurship from the perspective of, startup, pop-up shops, different businesses that people start and go into. And many times when we're talking about farming enterprises or agriculture enterprises, we don't look at those things as entrepreneurships. But at the end of the day, if you're interested in farming, you're interested in local food systems, you're starting a business just like anyone else, right? And so you have to look at these opportunities as entrepreneurship opportunities. And so we're working with local economic development corporations and local municipalities. So when they're starting their planning processes of how we better deal with these things, to make sure that food and agriculture is a part of that process. Increase jobs in communities, but also training and skills development. There's something to be said about the physical nature of agriculture and food system work, health with mental health and social awareness, and just to be engaged with the earth and the soil, right? It's a big piece of that. So that was a key piece of that for us. So just to wrap up about the first piece of this with the food system development piece, I look at health as an outcome of we do a lot of work that relates to community health, nutritional health. And so I look at health as an outcome of the individual choices that consumers make. And so we talked about, those factors that drive consumer behavior, but also I look at opportunities for market availability in all of us, right? And so in that regard, we have to ensure that we have food available in various communities, people that need it the most, but also to everybody. And so if you're looking for opportunities in food and agriculture, those opportunities are here for you today that may not have existed, several decades ago for an individual that is coming out of college and I want to figure out what to do. I don't have access to a large plot of land, where there are now opportunities available, particularly here in this state that we haven't always had, that are available for you to do that. There's interest and opportunity here, but you have to be able to find those resources. And so, institutions like the LSU Ag Center, the Acadiana Food Alliance here in Lafayette, there are several organizations in New Orleans that has these resources for you to do those things. And so getting in that and just really engaging with those folks. So the second part of what we talk about here today is our work dealing with food access, retail level purchasing behavior for healthful food in rural Louisiana. So for me, there's a focus on purchasing behavior at the retail level, because based upon consumer surveys by the USDA over the past several years, what we know that here in this country is that about 92% of the population purchases their food, different types of food products, from supermarkets and grocery stores. And so that was kind of the driving force of the focus. And then I do know that local farmers markets, other areas, do have an impact in local communities by virtue of how consumers purchase food. But for me, because I buy the majority of my food from grocery stores as well, having a focus on retail level, so grocery stores, we'll define what that looks like, was important for me in going through that process. What we know about rural food access, right? Many rural communities are defined by food insecurity at many different levels. And so many of them may be referred to as food deserts, this notion of food deserts. And so when we're looking at this from the perspective of healthful foods, is that one, healthful foods may not be available in these communities, or in the situation where healthful food is available in these communities, it may be priced at a point that may not be affordable, right? And so if you live in the inner city of a specific community, versus you going to Super One Foods and buying, 4 apples for, let's say, $1, you may go into a convenience store in certain communities and only get about 1 apple for $1, things like that. And so making sure looking at how that's defined. And so that's how we define typically food insecurity in many of these communities, generally from an economic perspective. Also looking at the nutritional vulnerability of our rural communities, right? In many cases, because many of these systemic factors that take place, the lack of availability of foods, many of our rural consumers sacrifice healthful food choices just to eat, right? And so in order to eat, you may not be able to eat the highest quality. You may not be able to eat or purchase the freshest fruits and vegetables, right? And so what we see here is this leads to different issues of access, availability, and affordability. Also, what has to be accounted for here is the impact of food assistance programs in many communities that many consumers take part in. So the biggest one here for this country is the SNAP benefits program. And economically, a program like SNAP benefits or a safety net program like that has two economic purposes there. One, it creates the illusion that it makes foods cheaper, but it also creates a situation where consumers have more income to spend on. Now, the type of food that people purchase with those benefits, that's a different conversation. But just the general premise of the safety net program is one, to make foods cheaper, but also provide consumers additional income or the illusion of additional income to purchase different sets of food. And so that was kind of the focus for that work. So again, if we look in Louisiana, for a state that's typically ranked towards the bottom of many health rankings, right? We have a lot of rural areas in the state. So much of it with our rural areas, if we look at kind of what defines our rural areas, 16% of our state's population is rural, right? Within those rural areas, about 25% of the population in the rural areas are indicated to live below the poverty line, right? But which means many of these communities are also designated as food deserts. We look at them as food deserts, which is kind of strange because many of our rural areas, the predominant economic driver in these communities is agricultural production. The issue with that is that while there's agricultural production in many of our rural areas, most of that production, the vast majority of that production, is in commodities crops that don't end up on the consumer, or at least directly on the consumer's table. And if you look at some specific examples, Tensas, Madison, and East Carroll parishes, the 3 parishes that are up in the northeast corner of the state where I come from, we have an even higher poverty level than what we find at the state level. And there are a few retail options that exist in these parishes in general. For example, if you look at Tensas, Madison, East Carroll parish individually, each parish only has 1 grocery store. So, for example, like if you go to Tensas Parish, there's three towns in Tensas Parish, there's only 1 grocery store in that entire parish that exists in the city of St. Joseph, which is the parish seat. And so many times what happens here is that because of this, for consumers that have transportation or have access to transportation, they have to go to other communities to purchase food. And so you may have to drive 25, 30, 45 minutes just to go to, say, a Walmart supercenter or a larger supermarket to purchase your food. And so that creates some issues for us as well. Or for those that don't have transportation, well, you're limited to the fast food, fried food places that we may have in these communities, or you end up being an outcome of your environment, which leads to negative nutritional outcomes. So we frame this thing into two areas. We frame this thing into consumer access, and so if one healthful food is not available, but if it is available, it's of low quality and not affordable to consumers. We also frame it from the perspective that consumers sacrifice their food choices, but we also highlight in many of these communities that there are issues of access, availability, and also affordability related to healthful foods. The flip side of it is that, looking at consumer behavior, we know that the consumer behavior among individuals is very dynamic. We make choices frequently, situational, dynamic. We all make various different choices, and so we highlight those things. Those choices are also impacted by our financial situation, the prices that are available to us, but also the food environment, and then the more social aspects of it, culture and family, economic reality also goes into it as well. So if we look at kind of the composition of our retail environment, many of our retail environments are defined by one, small size independent grocers, or grocers, very small grocery stores that also sell gas, like I grew up with, or you have some convenience stores, or you have some gas stations. But this, particularly for rural areas, is what defines the food environment. If we look at a larger, more affluent food environment, like we find here in most areas of Lafayette, you have your larger supermarkets and grocery stores, and you have all of these things that comprise the food environment. So much of the nutritional health of our consumers is an outcome of the food environment that's available to us. And unfortunately, the food environment that we see in the diagram is not available to many communities, the majority of communities, outside of our more rural areas. And so we have to deal with those things. We have to highlight those things. And so that was part of what the purpose of this work was. And so look at the problem. One, we've talked about kind of the disparities that we found across Louisiana's food environments, particularly the rural communities here in Louisiana. But interestingly enough, particularly for the state of Louisiana, there hasn't been much work recently that's been done to talk about, one, purchasing behavior for healthy food. And so from an economic perspective, that work exists, but also that we're focusing on more economic-based dimensions of food access, and we'll highlight what those economic-based dimensions of food access are. But also, I kind of nerded out on this piece here, more so looking at the psychosocial-based dimensions that define consumer choice for healthy foods is kind of what we focused on. And so I took kind of a step away from my economics background, and we created some metrics to measure more psychosocial-based dimensions of consumer choice. And we define those here shortly, but the metrics that I use are based upon consumer attitude, social influence, but also just consumer perceptions of their environment. Our perceptions of what our reality are oftentimes dictates what our actions are. And so that part of that went into the model. So what we did here was we created some frameworks to look at and to assess consumer purchasing behavior for healthful foods. And we did that in two ways. And so the first part that I talked about was these more psychosocial based dimensions of consumer access, consumer choice. And so attitude, personal control, or perception of personal control, and also social influence. Historically, out of the literature, out of the psychology literature, this model is based off this theory of planned behavior that really posits and looks at how attitude, perceived personal control, and societal norms as mediated by consumer intentions to do a specific action, really looks at how those things influence the actions or the outcomes of the consumer or the individual. So in this particular model, I didn't include intention specifically because I just simply wanted to know if there was an impact on one, perceived personal control, social influences, and also attitude among consumers and how they impacted purchasing behavior. The other side of this was looking at more economic-based dimensions. And so looking at how consumer perceptions of accessibility, how consumer perceptions of availability, and how consumer perceptions of affordability ultimately impacted their purchasing behavior. So we did this through a survey, it was a statewide survey, conducting a consumer survey with a primary focus on rural areas during a pandemic is not a fun process, because much of the work, particularly if you're working with rural areas, you really need to be on the ground going to door trying to collect information. Because there's oftentimes a disconnect with collecting electronic data. And so most of the data that we'll see here that we collected, we ended up getting more urban responses than we wanted to, but that was by virtue of us simply having to do this thing electronically. And so we created a survey instrument, the Retail Purchasing Behavior for Vegetable Survey. Of course, there was some participant screening. We looked at vegetable purchasing behavior among consumers. We also looked at those psychosocial based influences, those economic based influences, and then we collected some general consumer information there. Fortunately, we set out to get about 300 responses here, and we only got about 161 usable responses. And so of that 161 usable responses, within our analysis and our write-up here, we included 90 responses. So disclaimer to this, this was kind of the first part of a larger study we wanted to do. So even though we had 90 responses, we're going to put this information out again and try to drive up our survey responses. Now that we can move around and do some additional things, we're going to be on the ground in some of these rural communities, collecting more data, because I'm very interested in getting this data specifically from rural communities. As you can see with the breakdown of the 90 responses that we have here, 36 of the respondents came from more metropolitan areas. 18 of those responses came from your more suburban areas, and 36 of those respondents in the 90 came from small town or rural areas. Just to kind of provide a general overview and breakdown of what we found in the data there. So generally what we found from this is that based upon the constructs that we created, overall, the respondents to the survey were in general agreement about the statements that we put out to them related to both attitude and perceived personal control. What that related to was that, consumer attitude and their perception of their environment were positive in that they had positive influences on their purchasing behavior in those communities. They were pretty neutral about their responses to the social influences, which we took to mean from that was that, the folks that responded to our survey were going to, purchase, in this particular case, vegetables, whether or not someone outside told them to do that or not. Through some correlation analysis there, we found relationships existed between attitude and social influence and perceived personal control. But we also validated our model, the model that we projected here to explain purchasing behavior. So the model that was inclusive of attitude, social influences, and perceived personal control, we were able to validate that model, which is going to lead us to doing a larger, probably more regional, and maybe a national study in the next few years related to those psychosocial based constructs. One other thing that to note here is that there may be some mediating factors that were not included in our model that also played a role in purchasing behavior. But just very briefly, so we did structural equation modeling here. I'm not going to go too deep into the theoretical perspectives of this, but we found positive relationships between perceived personal control and the social influences related to purchasing behavior, but also that there was a negative relationship between attitude and purchasing behavior, and which was interesting to me because if I'm looking at the outcomes of this, I would think that the higher an individual's agreement with attitude, the better off it would be, or the better their purchasing behavior would be. So that's something that was an interesting outcome for me here, that we're going to have to go back and look at that and do some more deep analysis with that to explain why that's a negative, why that was a negative relationship that was found there. Part of me wants to say that with a larger data set and a broader and wider ranging data set of consumers, that may not be the case. So that just may simply be something that's an outcome of the statistics due to such a small sample size. But the only way for us to validate that is as we collect additional data here, we'll be able to have more information available related to that. On the flip side of this, the economic-based dimensions of consumer access, one, based upon the individuals that responded to our survey, we can say that there was demand for vegetables that existed. So the majority of the respondents said that they purchased fresh vegetables. The majority of the respondents said that they bought vegetables at supermarkets and grocery stores. And the majority of respondents said that they, on average, that they, spent $33 on investment. Now, disclaimer here is that I think that, much of these numbers is based upon the individuals that responded. Of course, they responded to the survey. And so we had a much more representative rural sample, individuals that may not have access or always have access to transportation. These numbers would look very different. So that's why it's important for us to go back out and do some additional analysis, collect some additional data to kind of help to see what the numbers really look like. All of these individuals in the study primarily indicated that they always had access to a vehicle to get to a grocery store. And so issues of access, availability, and affordability weren't always necessarily an issue for particularly the respondents to this particular survey. There was general agreement with statements related to availability and accessibility, but the respondents were neutral related to the statements of affordability. We found that there was a relationship between access and availability, but there were no correlational relationships between our three constructs and purchasing behavior. And so by virtue of that, we were not able to determine that a model existed that explained purchasing behavior based upon our economic-based constructs. But that again, I think part of that was due to such a small sample size, which we're going to account for by doing some additional data collection. This is just the first part of this study. So just two last things here to wrap up. So we've been doing some work to really look at developing some national indicators of how we measure food access nationally. And so part of what my recommendation to those folks has been to look at measures of domains of availability, affordability, accessibility. And we have some national data sets that are already available to us. So the USDA, U.S. Department of Agriculture Economic Research Service has certain metrics and has certain national data that's available to us that we can use, but also looking at metrics of acceptability and accommodation. I work with a number of different nonprofit organizations around the country, and we're all doing great work related to food access and ensuring that consumers have access to affordable, healthful, nutritious foods. But for me, it's really important to have this notion of acceptability, particularly when much of the work that's being done is being done by individuals that come from outside of communities, that come into communities, and may not be aware of what the dynamics of the existing communities are. The last piece of this is related to agriculture and food system development here. And so one, we have data available there related to composition and structure of our farming enterprises, but also a real key thing here is land access and tenure. We have data that's available for that. We can get most of this data available from the Census of Agriculture, but also the USDA National Agricultural Statistics Service is beginning to collect more of this data, but also particularly for new and beginning farmers. So if any of you are interested in those things, making sure that we have, universities supporting new businesses, local economic development corporations, and working with them to collect data about how do we better serve our new and beginning farmer populations. And so with that, I wish I was still at Yosemite hanging out, but back to academic life. Any questions?